billionaire lay motionless to test his driver's son. What the boy did changed everything. The boy froze the moment he saw the billionaire lying on the cold marble floor. His pale face turned slightly to the side, eyes closed, chest unnervingly still. One arm resting at an unnatural angle, as if life had quietly slipped out of him. For a split second, the mansion felt like it stopped breathing. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, crushing, terrifying. The child's small fingers tightened around the folded dollar bills he'd been counting just moments ago, his heart pounding so loud it might wake the man on the floor. If he were truly alive, the billionaire had chosen this moment carefully. Richard Hargreaves, one of the most powerful men in the country, had built his empire by testing people when they least expected it. Boardrooms, factories, private meetings, he believed truth only surfaced under pressure. And today, lying perfectly still in his own mansion, he was testing someone no one thought mattered, the young son of his longtime driver. The boy's name was Elijah. Elijah hadn't been invited into the mansion that day. He was simply waiting for his father, sitting quietly in a corner near the living area, exactly where he had been told to stay. He was used to being invisible in places like this. His father had taught him that. Don't touch anything. Don't speak unless spoken to. Rich people don't like noise, his father always said, not bitterly, but cautiously, as if the rules of survival had been memorized long ago. Richard had noticed the boy earlier. Noticed how quietly he sat. How carefully he folded the worn dollar bills his father had given him for lunch. How he didn't stare at the expensive furniture or the massive glass windows overlooking the city. That discipline intrigued him. And curiosity, for a man like Richard, often turned into experiments. So Richard told his staff to leave. He instructed the security cameras to keep rolling. Then, without warning, he lowered himself to the floor and became perfectly still. Minutes passed. Elijah noticed first because children notice what adults ignore. He sensed something wrong before he understood it. The billionaire hadn't moved. Not even slightly. No shifting. No sigh. No impatient gesture. Just stillness. At first, Elijah thought the man was sleeping. But something about the way his hand rested open, lifeless, made the boy's stomach twist. Elijah stood up slowly, unsure if he was even allowed to move. His eyes darted toward the hallway, expecting someone to yell at him to sit back down. No one came. The mansion felt enormous now, like it had swallowed sound itself. Excuse me, sir. The boy whispered, his voice barely louder than air. No response. Elijah took a cautious step closer. He could see the billionaire's face clearly now. Older than the pictures in magazines, softer, more human. And frighteningly still. Panic crept into the boy's chest. He had seen this once before, when his neighbor collapsed at church. The way people screamed. The way someone cried for help. The way adults suddenly looked small and helpless. Elijah dropped to his knees beside the man without thinking. He placed his ear near the billionaire's chest, just like he had seen on television. His hands trembled. He listened. Nothing. His eyes widened. Fear surged through him, but not fear of punishment, not fear of breaking rules. Fear of losing a life in front of him. The boy looked around desperately. No phone, no adults. Just him. He did the one thing no one expected. Elijah pressed his small hands against the man's chest and pushed. Awkwardly, clumsily, unsure if it was right. He counted under his breath, just like the school nurse once taught them during an assembly. 1, 2, 3. His arms weren't strong. His rhythm wasn't perfect. But his determination was unshakable. Richard felt every push. He felt the uneven pressure. The panic-driven timing. The unmistakable weight of sincerity. This wasn't performance. This wasn't fear of consequence. This was instinct. This was compassion. Still, Richard didn't move. The boy stopped, tears spilling freely now. Please, Elijah whispered, his voice cracking. Please don't die. I can go get help. I promise. Just stay. He scrambled to his feet, slipping slightly on the smooth floor, and ran toward the hallway shouting for help, breaking every rule he had ever been taught about being quiet in places like this. That was the moment Richard opened his eyes, and what he saw wasn't relief or gratitude reflected in the boy's face. It was shock, followed by confusion, and then something deeper, something that would change everything. The moment Richard Hargreaves opened his eyes, the air in the mansion seemed to snap back into motion, like a breath finally released after being held too long. Elijah stumbled backward in shock, his small body stiffening as if he'd been caught doing something terribly wrong. His heart hammered in his chest, not with relief, but with fear that he had crossed a line invisible yet absolute in places like this. Richard didn't move right away. He simply lay there, watching the boy with a gaze sharper than any boardroom stare. In that silence, something rare happened inside the billionaire. The test he had designed to expose selfishness had instead uncovered something far more unsettling, genuine, instinctive compassion from a child who had absolutely nothing to gain. You didn't run, Richard finally said. His voice calm, measured, almost gentle. Elijah swallowed hard. I thought you were dead, sir, he whispered. I didn't know what else to do. Most adults, Richard knew, would have frozen or worse, checked for witnesses before calling for help. Some might have panicked about liability. Others might have walked away entirely. But this boy had knelt down without hesitation, without calculation, and tried to save him with hands far too small for the task. Where's your father? Richard asked as he slowly sat up. Elijah pointed shakily toward the garage. He's the driver. He told me not to move. Richard nodded, absorbing the weight of that sentence. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't exist. Those were the unspoken rules Elijah had learned long before stepping foot into this mansion. Richard stood and straightened, his suit as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. But inside his mind raced. He had spent decades studying people, testing loyalty, filtering sincerity from ambition. Yet a boy who didn't even know his name had undone all of it in minutes. Come with me, Richard said. Elijah hesitated. Every instinct screamed danger. But something in the man's eyes, something softened by truth, made the boy follow. They walked toward the garage where Elijah's father, Marcus, stood beside the car, posture rigid, eyes downcast. The way years of service had trained him. When he saw his son approaching the billionaire, his face drained of color. I'm so sorry, sir, Marcus blurted out, stepping forward. He must have wandered. He didn't wander, Richard interrupted. He saved a life. Marcus froze. Richard explained everything slowly, deliberately, never once exaggerating. When he finished, the garage was silent except for the distant hum of the city beyond the walls. I tested him, Richard admitted. And I failed. Marcus's eyes filled with tears he tried desperately to hide. He's just a boy, he said quietly. He doesn't know anything about tests. That's exactly why he passed, Richard replied. That evening, Richard canceled every meeting. He sat at the dining table with Elijah and Marcus, a scene no one would have believed without proof. He asked Elijah questions not about school grades or ambitions, but about how he felt when he thought someone was dying. I didn't think about myself, Elijah said honestly. I just didn't want you to be alone. Those words stayed with Richard long after the boy had gone to bed in the guest room, another rule broken. Another boundary erased. Over the next few days, Richard watched Elijah closely. Not from cameras or reports, but from presence. He saw how the boy helped staff without being asked. How he thanked people who were usually ignored. How he spoke gently to those who seemed invisible. Elijah didn't know the rules of power, but he understood humanity instinctively. Richard began to question everything. He thought about the executives who smiled through negotiations while planning betrayals. The charity galas where donations were more about appearances than impact. The countless tests he had designed, all of them flawed, because they expected people to reveal goodness under pressure, instead of recognizing it in quiet moments. On the fourth morning, Richard made a decision that would ripple through his entire empire. He summoned his legal team, not to rewrite contracts, not to restructure companies, but to change lives. He created a trust in Elijah's name, not as a reward, but as a responsibility. A foundation focused on emergency response training for children in underserved communities. He insisted Elijah's story remain anonymous. "This isn't about praise," Richard said. "It's about proof." Marcus tried to refuse. Pride battled gratitude in his chest. But Richard stopped him gently. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's accountability. Your son reminded me who I was before I learned to test people instead of trusting them." When the media eventually caught wind of the changes, because they always did, headlines exploded. Analysts speculated. Critics scoffed. But Richard didn't care. For the first time in decades, his decisions weren't driven by fear of betrayal. They were driven by faith. And every time Richard saw Elijah, after that, whether during foundation events or quiet dinners, he remembered the feeling of small hands pressing desperately against his chest, trying to bring him back to life. That in a way, they had. The changes Richard Hargreaves set into motion after that day did not arrive with fireworks or public announcements. They came quietly, almost invisibly, the way the most meaningful shifts in life usually do. To the outside world, Richard was still the same billionaire: sharp suits, private cars, guarded expressions. But inside his mansion, and inside himself, something fundamental had begun to realign. Elijah stayed for a week. At first, the boy moved through the mansion the same way he always had: careful steps, soft voice, eyes lowered. Old habits don't disappear just because kindness appears once. Richard noticed this immediately. He noticed how Elijah flinched whenever a door closed loudly, how he instinctively stood when an adult entered the room, how he apologized even when he had done nothing wrong. These weren't manners. They were survival skills. One evening, Richard found Elijah in the library, sitting cross-legged on the floor instead of the leather chair beside him. The boy was reading a book about stars, tracing diagrams with his finger as if touching the universe itself. "You know you can sit there," Richard said, pointing to the chair. Elijah shook his head. "It's okay, sir. I'm fine down here." Richard felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. He pulled a chair down himself and sat on the floor beside the boy. Elijah looked up, startled. "You don't always have to be small," Richard said quietly. "Not here." The boy didn't respond right away. He just nodded, uncertain whether this was a rule that would last. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay awake replaying the moment on the marble floor, not his own stillness, but the boy's panic. He realized something deeply uncomfortable. Elijah had shown more courage in those few minutes than most adults Richard knew had shown in their entire lives. Not strategic courage, moral courage, and moral courage was something Richard's world quietly punished. The next morning, Richard invited Marcus to breakfast. Marcus sat stiffly at the edge of the chair, hands folded, eyes never quite meeting Richard's. Years of hierarchy don't dissolve easily. "I want to ask you something," Richard said. "And I want an honest answer." "Yes, sir." "Have I ever made you feel invisible?" Marcus hesitated. Then he smiled politely, the practiced smile of someone who knows honesty can be dangerous. "You've always been fair, sir." Richard shook his head. "That wasn't the question." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Marcus exhaled. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly. "But that's just the way things are." Richard leaned back slowly. That answer hurt more than anger ever could. Later that day, Richard did something that stunned his executive staff. He asked them to come to the mansion, not for a meeting, but for a conversation. No presentations. No agendas. Just chairs in a circle. They didn't understand it. Some were visibly uncomfortable. Others looked annoyed. Richard spoke first. "I want each of you to tell me the name of the person who cleans your office," he said. Blank stares. "I want you to tell me the name of the security guard who opens the door for you every morning." He continued. More silence. "And I want you to tell me," Richard said, his voice calm but cutting, "when was the last time you truly saw the people who make your success possible?" The room shifted uneasily. That conversation lasted hours. Careers were not ended that day, but perspectives were shaken. Richard wasn't interested in punishment anymore. He was interested in awareness. Meanwhile, Elijah returned to school. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not because he was told to keep quiet, but because he didn't see it as a story. To him, helping someone in trouble wasn't heroic, it was normal. That innocence was exactly what made the act so powerful. But the world has a way of testing innocence. Weeks later, Elijah collapsed during recess. Panic spread through the playground. Teachers rushed in. An ambulance arrived. Marcus received the call that every parent fears. He drove behind the sirens with his heart pounding, praying under his breath. At the hospital, doctors spoke in careful tones. A congenital heart condition, undetected, dangerous. Marcus felt the ground give way beneath him. When Richard arrived at the hospital, he didn't arrive as a billionaire. He arrived as a man who knew what it felt like to lie motionless and be saved by someone smaller, weaker, braver. He listened. He waited. He didn't interfere. Only after the diagnosis was confirmed did Richard step forward, not to buy solutions, but to ensure time wasn't wasted. The best specialists were called. Not because of money, but because urgency mattered. Elijah survived the surgery. When he woke up, groggy and confused, the first thing he saw wasn't a machine or a doctor. It was Richard, sitting quietly beside the bed. "You scared us," Richard said softly. Elijah frowned. "I'm sorry." Richard smiled sadly. "You don't need to apologize for being human." In that hospital room, something subtle but profound happened. The balance of power disappeared completely. There was no billionaire. No driver's son. Just two lives that had intersected in a way neither could undo. And outside that room, a decision was forming, one far bigger than foundations or trusts. Decision that would challenge Richard's entire identity. When Elijah was finally discharged from the hospital, the world did not suddenly become softer or fairer. Bills still existed. Schools still labeled children by their parents' income. Drivers were still expected to stay quiet, to arrive early, to leave late, and to remain unseen. But something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Richard felt it the moment he watched Marcus help Elijah into the car, his hands shaking just slightly as he fastened his son's seatbelt. That quiet fear, that constant vigilance, was something Richard had never truly known. For the first time, he understood that wealth had protected him, not just from discomfort, but from helplessness. That realization haunted him back at the mansion. Richard stood alone in the same room where he had once laid motionless on the floor, pretending to be dead to test a child. The marble felt colder now, smaller. The test that once seemed clever now felt embarrassingly shallow. He understood something with painful clarity. He had been testing people his whole life because he didn't trust goodness to exist without pressure. Elijah had proven him wrong. A week later, Richard called Marcus into his study. No assistants. No lawyers. Just two men sitting across from each other. "I want to offer you something," Richard said. "And before you refuse, I want you to listen." Marcus straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir." "I want you to stop being my driver," Richard continued. Marcus's heart sank. "If I've done something, you haven't," Richard interrupted gently. "But I have." Marcus looked confused, almost frightened. "I don't need a driver anymore," Richard said. "I need a partner." Silence filled the room. Richard explained slowly. He spoke about expanding the foundation Elijah had unknowingly inspired, about creating emergency response programs in schools, about training children not just to memorize facts, but to act with courage when it mattered, about building something rooted in empathy, not image. "I can fund it," Richard said, "but I can't lead it alone. You understand the world this is meant to serve in ways I never will." Marcus's hands trembled. "Sir, I don't have the education for something like that." Richard leaned forward. "You raised a son who tried to save a stranger's life without hesitation. That's the only qualification that matters." Marcus didn't cry. He sat there quietly, absorbing the weight of a life he had never imagined being offered. "I'll think about it," he finally said. Richard nodded. "That's all I ask." Meanwhile, Elijah returned to school with a small scar on his chest and a story he still didn't tell. But something was different. When a classmate fell on the playground, Elijah didn't freeze. When a teacher looked overwhelmed, he asked if he could help. Compassion, once awakened, does not retreat. Word spread quietly among parents. Then teachers. Then administrators. A boy who didn't panic. A boy who acted. The foundation launched without Elijah's face or name on it. Richard insisted on that. "Let the work speak," he said. Training programs rolled out across districts. Emergency drills became lessons in humanity, not fear. Children learned that doing the right thing didn't require permission. And Richard changed too. He stopped testing people. He started trusting them. Executives noticed. Deals slowed but deepened. People stopped performing goodness and started practicing it. Some left, uncomfortable with the shift. Others stayed, transformed by it. One evening, months later, Richard hosted a small dinner at the mansion. No press, no donors. Just Marcus, Elijah, and a few staff members who had worked in the house for years. Richard stood and raised his glass. "I used to believe power revealed truth," he said. "Now I know truth reveals power." He looked at Elijah not with pride, not with ownership, but with gratitude. "You didn't change my life because you were brave," Richard continued. "You changed it because you were kind." Elijah smiled shyly. "I just didn't want you to be alone." That sentence, spoken again, landed differently this time, years later. When Richard was asked in an interview what moment defined his legacy, he didn't mention companies, acquisitions, or wealth. He said, "The day I pretended to be dead, and a child reminded me how to live."